John here. Hey, so for this 30-day series, what we're doing is we are trying to link together psychologically different tasks I was trying to do for the 30 days during the summer and so forth. But anyway, but this was I didn't really come up with too much to do for today. So actually, I was going to look at this. This is sort of like a psychological map of a bunch of concepts. I kind of made this a while ago on this Noda Mind Map. It's this 3D mind mapping program. It looks pretty good, but it could be a little more organized looking. But so anyway, but I just put together, as you can see, like the Jung is kind of like the center part of that. So I guess what we'll do is just start. There's no particular way. I can just try to go through some of these as we circumambulate, just to kind of start from Jung and then maybe and change the color of these. So okay, so we got Jung, okay, and then what do we want to say about him? Okay, well, there's the idea of archetypes. So with Jung, there's always the idea of archetypes, is the idea that there's these kind of sub-personalities, these universal personalities that happen to be the culture, and they tend to like influence you when you come under their influence, and then they can influence you whenever you do, unconsciously or consciously. They're different little like stories that people tend to try to live out, and their personalities in our unconscious to try to make us live a certain way. And in our unconscious, there's also a thing called active imagination. And that's just the idea that anytime you kind of let your mind go and you see certain things when you're awake or whatever, but you kind of get into a certain state, you can start getting certain information from your unconscious. And one idea that Jung had about the active imagination is you kind of take one little fragment of fantasy or whatever's going on, just kind of let it go, and then kind of like you're kind of like letting it happen, but you're kind of guiding a little bit why it's active imagination. And because of that, you're able to sometimes get information that'll help you out, the same as you can get through dreaming about what your unconscious is trying to tell you. And then, so here's the unconscious here, actually. And then if also related to this is complexes. Complexes are also like, just like the way an archetype, now they're more fundamental for everybody, but a complex is more like the thing we interact with in our life. So it's just a bunch of linked concepts to each other. It's a thing that where they have there's a certain amount of dissociativity. When you hit a certain thing like in a complex or something like that, it kind of slows down because there's these groups kind of cluster together and they tend to like reinforce each other in complexes. And so that's the idea. So basically complexes in an archetype. So this is really what we deal with, lots of different complexes in us in the unconscious that act as kind of like a kind of sub-personality that have a certain amount of autonomy over us. I mean, not completely, but but to a certain extent. And then, of course, everything in Jung is about the unconscious, which is just anytime you just stop thinking about something or you lose your attention to something, that information, whatever you're thinking about, goes into your unconscious, and especially stuff like sleeping and when you're dreaming, that's really the unconscious. And then but what we think about is like a iceberg type thing. Okay, then participation mystique. That's the idea that sometimes that it's like your mind can kind of be fused with the world, as far as like you can't really, for primitive man or maybe in other situations, they can't tell the difference between themselves and the outside world. And then like a lot of simple examples of things that still work is like a lot of times just like the feeling of just like having a certain object in your hand, kind of like in A Few Good Men, when the one character said that the Tom Cruise character said, "Oh, I think better with my bat." Well, there's lots of different things where sometimes people, or they put on masks, and somehow by getting these somehow their psyche is kind of linked to a certain object a lot of times, and it can actually create a big effect, actually having this object on them, or they're holding it, and everything. Okay, so in Jung, as far as like understanding the art appreciation, just like understanding beauty in the world in general, there's abstraction, which makes the world more simple, just takes a certain part, gives you kind of a simplified map of reality that makes the world more predictable, understandable, reproducible. Or there's empathy, which is more of a flowing thing. It's more of a flowing, so it's like you kind of more like flow into the art. You think like, kind of like it would be something more flowing and organic looking if we're talking about the felt into art, as far as like when it appears in actual art, Western art. but it can happen with things like just it doesn't have to actually be actual art. It could be like it could be just something. And then you got your abstract art over here too, which the abstract art. Now, one thing about the abstract art, and we'll go onto a little tangent over here, it's crystalline beauty. So it's kind of like the beauty of symmetry, not so much the living beauty, but just the beauty. Kind of like this is like got a little bit of a crystalline beauty to it, and it's like symmetry. So it doesn't have to do with that much life. So a lot of times, what I would think is someone like could sometimes worship what we call the bootstrap god, the god of competency. It has a certain beauty because it's just like a well-made machine or something like that, a great equation or something, where somebody like a Gus Fring is really going to believe in this bootstrap god. So that was my theory as far as like how like in Breaking Bad, how like the Gus Fring character, because he worships like the bootstrap god, the god of competency, the crystalline beauty. Pretty much Walter White does too, but he's maybe a little more irrational and stuff, driven by his pride emotion, where Gus Fring's the total like crystalline beauty. And then actually we'll go back down here to dreams. Okay, and then of course dreams, that's just another wave of the unconscious happening, which we know. And let's see. Oh, Maxwell's equation. I think this is actually supposed to be attached to this. Let's see. Okay. And Maxwell's equation, something like that. It's just something, yeah, like if you know physics, that was a certain really beautiful equation. And just by adding one term to it, it changed our understanding of how electromagnetics works. And so that was just an example, like E, or you can see other things like other beautiful equations like E equals MC squared. It's a lot of times this crystalline beauty that from abstract art and abstraction. It's a lot of its beauty is based on symmetry, simplicity, so how you can just reproduce things, then that you're able to reproduce things easily. Then abstract art too. It's it was more something that was in Greek culture. A lot of times it was more like the Doric columns or the Doric. It was something that was made to be more simple, geometric, that sort of thing, and it was kind of like not as true to life or whatever, as far as like the Ionian, which is the Athenians. Oh yeah, the Doric is mostly like the Spartans and other people down there. So they just had that kind of that Spartan attitude about life, that more abstract kind of harsh kind of view of life that kind of led to that kind of art like that. So whereas the Athenians over here, they had the Ionian art, and which was more living and everything. It had more like the idea of flowing. More of a flowing beauty. Now, we're starting to fill up our thing here. All right, now, Jung also believed in the anima, which that's going to be an archetype. And for a male, it's kind of like your ideal female inside. And it's sort of like he would say that a lot of times if you meet some girl that you really like and you get really kind of overwhelmed, if you're a guy that is, that you're kind of being overwhelmed by the idea of your anima. You're projecting your anima onto that person, so that's another thing with the unconscious. You got to remember that a lot of times you will be projecting stuff, putting stuff onto a mental map that's coloring your world that doesn't actually really exist. And then the opposite of that for the female would be the animus, that male part of them, so that, and now similar to the anima, but not the same, is the mother archetype, which is less active. It's more about anything that's like a circle, like a castle, a city. Those are the type of things that like the mother archetype. So the different archetypes, they kind of project like their information onto more solid things so like maybe you'll be feeling like, oh, this castle is really like a beautiful thing. This is really nice. Well, like a Jungian analysis would be, because part of why you think it's such a beautiful, great place is because it helps you kind of channel back into that mother archetype to get some feeling by being in it that you're getting into that mother archetype, which don't think of it so much like a real like mother, but it's much for as like any place where there's like shelter, enclosure. But then like there's the negative part where it can then suck you into, it becomes like a tomb, so like a fortress becomes like a tomb, a hole becomes like a tomb or whatever, Anyway, so, and let me see what else I can make red here. Okay, so then of course consciousness is also something that he believes in as well. And then, okay, then you got anima, like the female part here, which we mentioned. And then, okay, then of course there's a father archetype, which is more about ruling, that sort of thing, and more like, but really one of the things is like, because it's male, because he's a male archetype, he's related more to the idea of division, which is kind of what abstraction. So that's why you think about him as having something like a sword, a shovel, something like those are kind of symbols of like more like the male, or the knife, something that can cut. Something that can cut, knife, divide. That basically, when you think about it, it's usually kind of like a thing, a smaller device that then goes into something big, like the field, which would be like the mother archetype, the thing that you're digging up and creating your home out of it. And then, and another way, like mother archetype is linked to the idea of home a lot. Let's see, do I have it on here? No, I guess I don't have it on there. But a lot of times I say that a lot. It's like it's a circle, it's a mandala, it's a home. Now the flowing, the idea of division and flowing, they're kind of combined sometimes. A lot of times with archetypal saying, it seems like I hear like something like the King's Highway or something like that, and then flowing can also occur in stories. So I think about actually there being a sort of, if you want to think about it, like there's the flowing in art in regular Cartesian space or whatever, but then you could think about that maybe there's kind of like a flowing that goes on in this kind of this hyperspace with stories, and that's the way I think. And maybe I think that maybe some stories kind of like have more like a flow, and then you're kind of flowing in your life. You're flowing, you're empathizing, you're flowing into that story. You're feeling yourself into the story in the same way that like felt into art means like empathy means you feel yourself into like the shapes and what's going on. Well, that's the same way with stories, and then the highway things. I just noticed that's kind of a common theme. It's one of those sometimes you get this certain words seem to have that kind of give you that archetypal feeling where you get kind of like chills. You think, oh, there's something profound about this, and that's what I think. Like when I hear the word highways or the King's Highway or something like that, it's one of those kind of like power words. Now Leonard Cohen, he was one of the guys I liked, and he used a lot of archetypal language, but he used like the word highways a lot in some of his albums. That was so when you can go through a whole thing of like male, female in the relationship, and just say, well, the male also can correspond in physics to like a particle, where the female can correspond. This is where this is getting a little messy, to like a wave, something that's more, that moves around, doesn't have as much of a solid shape, but can be formed, and then more curvy shaped. And then a particle would be more like correspond more with digital, where a wave would correspond more with stuff that's analog. See, so we're coming up with a whole correspondence, like a big like list where we can put all these in columns. And then, okay, we'll leave the Spartans and the Athenians over here because we already mentioned them. I forgot to connect that. And then, okay, okay, the wave particle duality. You've heard of that, how they're both at the same time. And then now one key thing too is, okay, the particle and the male and everything, it goes over to this idea in Chinese philosophy of Yang being like, which is like, it's drawn as like a solid line instead of a solid line instead of a bending line or a dash line, which is Yin is the other type, the wave or the female. So that's another principle, the basic thing, that there's kind of like a mixture of kind of like a more passive principle and a more active principle, like something that like a yang is something like, it reacts to this creative force of, yin, it creates, it's like, it's like a womb, basically. It acts as like a type of material that basically reacts in a way to like the creative spark of yang to form something, so everything's kind of like a mixture of those, the male versus female type thing, conscious, unconscious. There's a whole list of different things we could say. And then, of course and then the main place, I don't know if it's the place they originally came up with it, or anyway, it's one of the highly linked places to the idea of yin and yang, is the I Ching, where they come up with these different like hexagrams that show like the different yin and yang lines that that show like sum up a certain situation at that time, basically. Okay, and then of course that all comes from Chinese philosophy, and they have something like the mandate of heaven, which reminded me like it's a Japanese cartoon, but I think it was based on some of the stuff like these more like emperor type places. There was stuff like the Comet Empire in Space Battleship Yamato. That was this one this Japanese cartoon that I liked, Space Battleship Yamato, and they had stuff like buried neighborhoods there. I remember that was one part that they had, like because there was this place where like whenever the Gamelons, they in the first season they dropped all these radioactive bombs all over the earth and made like the whole shape of the earth like dry and like radioactive because the Gamelons, they like that radiation is good for their body or whatever. So they were basically terraforming it. So they hit during that time period that before the Comet Empire came, they had to their humans had to go to these underground cities. Then later on, like it shows Kodai going back to the old like buried neighborhood down there, and there's this kind of interesting thing about that. There's kind of interesting kind of liminal space. Maybe your also represents maybe something like with the unconscious, but now there's also a thing where later Deslock, the one character who was a bad guy in the first, he finally decides to help out the Earth people. He says, "Oh, you must attack it from the top and the bottom," and that was kind of significant, almost like the unconscious, or something like that. I don't know. There was something that always seemed about that top and bottom thing. And let's see. I guess okay. So then we have getting over here from the unconscious and the conscious as well. You have a thing, and one archetypal story is the Night Sea journey, or the hero journey of basically going from conscious to unconscious, from like being raised up to being like destroyed and coming back to life again, more or less, in a symbolic way, So that was the whole thing of the Night Sea journey, and then you have like the Heart of Darkness, and that kind of talks about the darkness inside, that instinctual part that we don't understand. That was another book that kind of like deals with those sort of subjects, and then like tornado. I forgot what the tornado is, except for it's like kind of like that raw force. But I was thinking of when I was a kid, I used to always like I'd sign myself like John Tornado or something, because it was kind of like that idea of like that instinct and or something. I don't know. Yeah, this is all just like loose connections we're making between things that can sometimes be fun, but then one big principle with people like Nietzsche and Jung is like this idea of will to power, the idea that you want to like expand into the world and then reproduce yourself. That's one of the fundamental things. Like someone like Freud thought everything was just like came down just like the sexual thing, but somebody like Jung would say no. There was a lot of other motivations, like the will to power is one of them. And then now Snow Crash was a good book that was related to some of these type subjects, because it had stuff to do with like, well, let's just start from the one. Okay, the male and the female thing, like we had mentioned before. So let's just male and female, okay, and then okay, then the male archetype, and that the knife that Raven through these super sharp knives could cut through anything. And then there's like kind of like there's mentioned like these laser beams during that one scene where he's coming through, and the character Raven, who's kind of like this master surfer guy and ultimate badass guy who would throw these glass knives that could kill people, and was like a super harpooner and all this stuff. Anyway, but he was also surfing, so in a sense that's sort of like, well, it has part of like the female archetype, I guess, because in a sense it's sort of like, it's when you're on the board, it's kind of like home, So whenever you're in a car, that it's almost like it cuts through the world, kind of like a knife or something. But in a sense, if you're in it, it's like it's like home. It's like the mother archetype. And also, surfing is more like a thing where it's more of like a passive movement thing where you're responding. So it's more of like, it seems to be more of like, so the two main things he does in that book is he's really good at surfing. And by surfing, actually, it was like in a kayak, but whatever. But the thing is, he could ride these waves, to like incredible means, where it's just like, he didn't hardly even had to like use his muscles, because he was such a master of surfing these things, which would be more like so whenever he's doing that, that's more like, going with like that flow, more like the female archetype, where whenever he uses his knife, that's when that's the male part. Okay, then you have like the idea of like the arc, that there's always something in where someone gets put in some arc or something like in Superman or something like that, or Noah. And then, okay, so he also talks about the Sumerians. That's one of the main plots in Snow Crash, and the idea of a virus, which has a certain like crystalline kind of beauty to it, and then Enki was the one character. Okay, I'm not really having too much to say about a lot of this, but there was also a thing called the bicameral mind, where they said, "Oh yeah, that's right." That like part of your, that's kind of where this whole thing came from, his theory, because it was like this thing where the people, their brain was kind of controlled by this virus, or so basically that there's like that the idea that part of your brain just is controlled like a computer, basically, and the other part is more like, like an analog type thing or something. I think is the basic idea. So you can kind of like, I think maybe it's like because at some point until. I don't know. Okay, I forgot the exact theory behind that bicameral mind. I'll have to, but maybe not worry about it too much. And then, but it kind of gave, okay, but the idea is people had to get this. I guess the idea is people, I guess it was like that originally people, they could only live according to a script, like script living. They couldn't really think like consciously for themselves. So they just, stuff would be programmed into them or something. I guess that was the idea. And so, of course, people live according to archetypes a lot of times. And then they relied on their unconscious. Okay, so I guess we made everything red. I mean, hopefully I managed to at least quickly talk about a couple of these concepts here, So anyway, yeah, this is sort of like a small example of the way like the Jungian verse, the way that things are connected, in my mind, as far as like these different subjects that I've been talking about. So anyway. This 30-day YouTube miniseries is a psychological experiment using Jungian psychology to live better and experience more this summer. I'm not a psychologist, just a layman looking to apply Jungian principles to life. I'm starting with the idea that the unconscious mind is very smart and tells us things. And believing in this, I drove up to Hibbing, Minnesota, and I found that 4 locations in Hibbing, Minnesota corresponded quite well to 4 different principles called the Hibbing Quaternity. The first one is the Hibbing Ghost Town, which the characteristics is you feel the echo of the past as the wind flows down established paths. This represents unconscious voice being in the center of a moving circle, the mother archetype, home, center, castle, etc. Character I'm coming up with here to explain it is Nellie, the ghost sheepdog mom who circles the area, protects and guides. The Greyhound Museum has to do with travel and also the Jungian idea of beauty as a way of mentally feeling your way into physical objects and flowing into life in general, flowing beauty, mentally becoming part of the object. The character here I'm coming up with is Flows With It, which is a Native American cartoon character who has a magic canoe, finds all paths, glides over, portages, flows into life. Now the ore pit, it represents awe, the smallness of the individual, abstraction, and the way to in making the world simpler, more understandable. Actions, the beauty of symmetry, the beauty of maps, beauty of mathematics. And this is supposed to be Laser Nash. Doesn't look like him that much, but anyway, it's like John Nash with his cup sending out all these laser beams across, dividing the world, trying to find that order in the chaos from A Beautiful Mind, if you haven't seen that movie. Bob Dylan's home. It represents stories, archetypes, wishing to become someone else. DJ Hat Trick, what he does is he gets people into the groove by putting different hats on and sending people into different paths. It's sort of like the way we do whenever we listen to a song, for example. Here's a simplified view of the quaternity here that I'm going to be using for this 30-day adventure. And this is what it's going to more look like. I'm just going to do a simple sketch that I'll put in the video and then just kind of explain it like on a notepad like this to make it simpler so I can get it done. So I can do a video for 30 days. And so subscribe to get all 30 of those videos.